Okay, I think it's okay to start now. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for finding the time today to listen to us talk about Edmonton's carbon accounting framework. I'm Abhishek Chakraborti. I work as a senior environmental project manager at the city of Edmonton. And with me today, I have Yuill Herbert, who works as a consultant with SSG. Uh, so the format that we'll follow today would be Yuill and I will present for uh, the first 15 minutes. And if you have any questions that come up, we would uh, request you to hold them till the end or type them in the chat text so that we can respond to them once we finish our presentation. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the remaining 10 to 15 minutes of our presentation. So I'll get started with the presentation. I'll give you a bit of a context about how we got to Edmonton's carbon accounting framework. So Edmonton's City Council last year declared a climate emergency in the fall of 2019. And at the same time, they also realized that Edmonton's existing community energy transition strategy wasn't fast enough in getting us to meet our low carbon city targets by 2050 to make Edmonton a carbon neutral city by 2050. So because of that, the City Council also made a 8-part motion, which included the revision of the existing community energy transition strategy for the city of Edmonton, which we are working on right now, as well as evaluating an internal option for us to start accounting for our carbon emissions, like at a community level, as well as at a city of at a civic level. There were a couple of other things outlined in the motion, which included coming up with funding instruments and approaches for funding the revision of the community energy transition strategy. But Yuill and I will mostly be speaking about Edmonton's carbon accounting framework that SSG helped the city of Edmonton develop. Next slide, Yuill. So I'll move the conversation over to Yuill now. He'll provide you a bit of a context on the inspiration for carbon accounting and then the technical side of it. And then I'll talk a bit about the implementation of how we are approaching the implementation of carbon accounting at the city of Edmonton.
Thanks, Abby. So I'm just going to give a bit of a background on what is a carbon budget and how it works. A couple of years ago, the city of Edmonton hosted a conference called Cities IPCC, which was a bringing together of a lot of the people who were working on climate action in cities globally. It was a fascinating event held over the course of a couple of days at the conference center at City of Edmonton. And one of the presentations was by City of Oslo, and they talked about the carbon budget methodology that they were applying at that presentation. And I think as cities have grappled with the seriousness of climate change and the need to manage greenhouse gas emissions in a much more sophisticated way, there's been a search for methodologies to integrate consideration of climate throughout the decision-making of the organization. And the carbon budget or climate budget approach that Oslo has been pioneering, they're in their 4th annual climate budget now, is a really solid framework for integrating consideration of greenhouse gas emissions alongside financial considerations. The City of Oslo's approach has a number of interesting characteristics. I think one of the most novel ones is that in addition to its climate agency, which many large cities in Canada have in different forms, whether it's an environment division or whatever the structure might take, the carbon budgeting process and the GHG accounting process is managed not by that group, but by the finance department. And placing the responsibility for the carbon budget within the financial department gives the budget or the carbon budget itself a higher level of priority, and it aligns it directly with financial decision making. So that's been, I think, one of the big insights Unmute. Okay. So I'll move to the next slide. What is a carbon budget? So a carbon budget is really similar to a financial budget. It basically determines the patterns of GHG expenditure or GHG emissions for a particular year, and it's typically approved by council on an annual basis. As much as possible, it aligns GHG emissions management with financial management. So in a year, you might exceed your budget, then you have a deficit, or you might overachieve and reduce emissions more than your budget is, and then you would have a surplus. So it's really applying financial concepts to a carbon budget. It's typically both an annual and cumulative notion. And we know, and I'll show this in a second, that to remain within 1.5 degrees of warming, we can only emit so many more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, and it's an absolute total. And so the carbon budget seeks to align the share of those global emissions with a particular city. And to do that, many cities, of course, have been monitoring greenhouse gas emissions through an annual inventory or a biannual inventory, which is is backwards looking. It's like, how did we do in the past? And here's the greenhouse gas emissions that resulted. To manage a carbon budget, you have to start looking forwards. And this implies a carbon accounting framework. So it's starting to track the greenhouse gas emissions of projects and making sure that there's enough reductions associated with the potential projects to achieve the annual carbon budget. So it's a much more sophisticated, forward-looking approach to managing greenhouse gas emissions going forward. City of Edmonton calculated what its share of that remaining greenhouse gas emissions global carbon budget is. And this is just an illustration under the IPCC report. There's an indication that we have 2,500 gigatons of CO2 left between 1870 and 2100. We've used 1900 of that up till 2011. That leaves 600 left to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Edmonton's share, so that's 600,000 megatons or 600 gigatons. Edmonton's share of that remaining emissions chunk is calculated between 2020 and 2050 at 135 megatons. So that's basically Edmonton's cumulative carbon budget going forward. If Edmonton wants to do its fair share of addressing climate change, then it needs to limit its cumulative greenhouse gas emissions going forward to 135 megatons. So that's the cumulative carbon budget. And that's a really important concept. It can use that up really quickly by maintaining current rates of emissions, or it can drop off slowly and reduce its emissions well, fairly quickly, actually, to stay within that total. And I think there's a couple other caveats really to the global carbon budget. It continues to evolve as the scientists refine the concept as to how the actual global climatic system works. So it's not a perfect number, but it's certainly a solid target. The allocation to cities of the global target is a tricky process, and there's certainly value judgments that are made. Like, what is the actual fair share of Edmonton? As a rich city, should Edmonton take deeper emissions reductions than, say, Lagos in Nigeria, or some other city that still has very, very high levels of poverty and needs to emit more in the next while to bring its population out of poverty. So calculation of the fair share is a tricky process, and there's a number of different methods for calculating that, and that's also really a question of what level of leadership does a particular city want to take. And so that number will continue to evolve. So this is here, I think, starting to show how the carbon budget aligns with the conventional annual targets that many cities or municipalities or communities have adopted, like 20% reduction by 2030, or 50% reduction by 2040, or 80% reduction by 2050. So most of the targets historically have been a point in time, whereas the carbon budget is really about a chunk of emissions, an absolute chunk. It doesn't really matter about the reference year because you're talking about a certain chunk of emissions reductions that needs to happen year over year. So the whole gamemanship that has gone with let's choose 2006 as our baseline year, or 1990 as our baseline year, no longer really matters in the context of a carbon budget, which I think is really helpful from an accounting perspective. So you see along the top, we call it now a long-term carbon forecast, and that's aligning with the financial language again, financial forecasts. And that's what happens if nothing else changes. Then there's starting to project the budget trajectory is what we call the future carbon liability. So here's the specific case for Edmonton. There's the business as usual projection along the top. There's a trajectory that aligns with its carbon budget, the dark green area, 135 megatons between now and 2050. And the gap in between is the carbon deficit or carbon liability. And so what the carbon accounting framework does is take all of these actions, which are modeled out in some detail, and evaluate the GHG contribution that each one of them will make, and then line that up against the carbon budget on an annual cycle. And so each of those actions constitutes an opportunity, and the carbon budget or carbon budget planning cycle really builds those opportunities into or aligns them with the financial budget on an annual basis. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Abby.
Thanks, Yuill. So now I'll talk a bit more about the implementation, or how are we approaching the implementation of a carbon accounting framework at the City of Edmonton. So if you could move on to the next slide, Yuill. Just to give you a bit of context about the city, the size of the organization. City of Edmonton is an organization of 14,000 employees approximately, and implementing anything that is done at a corporate level is easier said than done. So I think that is one of the biggest obstacles that we are trying to deal with right now. And I think some of the objectives of Edmonton's carbon accounting would be the long-term and the short-term, short, medium to long-term objectives of implementing a carbon accounting framework in Edmonton would be an implementation of a mechanism to manage carbon emissions for the city, aligning what the existing operating and capital budget processes are, and how decisions and priorities are made at the City of Edmonton, and how do we find a way to integrate a carbon accounting framework into that existing framework of processes that exist at the city. And then where would the trade-offs and synergies be made between when it's more viable to make a financial investment as opposed to a GHG decision. For instance, if a project has a higher GHG footprint but has a lower financial cost, how do you make a decision on those kinds of projects, and especially when they are being done for community good in general, especially working at a not-for-profit public sector organization. You're not driven by the bottom line so much. Then tracking the community, civic, and corporate initiatives is one thing that is one of the challenges for us as an organization in terms of how do we do that through a carbon accounting framework, and then developing an accountability framework, which is a reporting framework and a monitoring framework on carbon accounting. And then finally, how do we scale this out throughout the organization and throughout the community at the City of Edmonton. If you could move on to the next slide, Yuill. So a couple of things that we have going for the City of Edmonton is that we already have the foundation established at the city. This like monitoring GHG emissions at a civic level is something that we've been doing for a couple of years now. So it's not completely new. We also have some policies that are on sustainable building practices that have been implemented at the city. And then we are already reporting a carbon emission on some of the civic operations project that we have that exist at the City of Edmonton. And then we have a existing community energy transition strategy that has existed at our organization since 2015. But having said that, there would be a couple of things though required for us to start working or implementing a carbon accounting framework within the organization. And one of them would be a manual or a guidebook is what we are calling it, which has like the draft of it has been developed with the help of SSG. And then there is also a carbon accounting tool, which is a way for us to quantify our carbon emissions in comparison to our annual carbon budget and our lifetime carbon budget. And then the third step would be a way for us to figure out how to integrate this with the carbon budgeting, how to integrate the carbon budgeting system with the operating and the capital budgeting processes that exist at our organization. If you could move on to the next slide here. So now I'll get a bit more into the implementation side of our Edmonton's carbon accounting framework. Next slide, please. So the implementation objectives are pretty similar to the carbon accounting framework objective. The first obvious objective is how do we implement a framework to manage the city's carbon budget? Then how do we align this with the existing operating and capital budgeting processes and decisions? And then what is the trade-offs and synergies for financial and GHG decisions? And then being able to track civic and corporate actions and policies in context of carbon budget. And then finally, how do you build literacy within the organization and within the community to scale this out? So these are pretty similar to the carbon accounting framework if you go back and look at them. In terms of the implementation approach that we are taking, we are taking a staggered implementation approach for implementing the carbon accounting framework, just because of the complexity of how the framework works and the amount of education and advocacy that would need to be done internally within the organization and externally as well within the community to start being efficient and effective at implementation of our carbon accounting framework. So the way we have dealt with it is the first phase of it involved research and analysis, which was completed in March of 2020. And it mostly involved jurisdictional scans, talking to other cities around the globe who are implementing a carbon accounting framework, and then coming up with the structure and the framework as to what would it entail to come up with a carbon accounting framework. The second phase of it involved the approach and the development. So if you recall, I mentioned that the carbon accounting framework requires a manual for people to, or a protocol manual where people can understand, where project managers within the organization can understand how to manage, how to calculate the carbon emissions for a particular project. So that was something that we developed in phase 2 of the project, as well as we also looked at developing a carbon accounting tool, which is to quantify the amount of emissions at a project level that contribute to the overall annual carbon budget in terms of a positive contribution or a negative contribution to the overall carbon budget for the organization in any given year. In terms of phase 3, which is currently underway and would continue on for the next couple of months, is to build capacity within the organization. So by capacity, I mean, as you mentioned, that this is housed within, like at the City of Oslo, this was housed within the financial budget office. So first, how do we ensure that the financial budget office within the City of Edmonton is well equipped to actually take this responsibility on? Then what are the number of resources, what are the type of resources that would be required internally for the City of Edmonton to start implementing it? And then the training and the education education part would also follow the capacity building phase, where you start developing those training and education programs for not only a city, but also the community in general, for them to start reporting on their community scale emissions. The last phase would be the implementation pilot phase. At the City of Edmonton, we have a 4-year budget cycle. So our next 4-year budget cycle would be 2023 to 2026 is when we intend to pilot a carbon accounting framework for the City of Edmonton. And this would be the first time the council will see how this framework could actually work. And in the subsequent years, we'll keep on improving the framework from our learnings and the reporting that we get from the prior years. If you could move on, Yuill. So
I think we're very running out of time here.
Okay, so I'll quickly go through the challenges. In terms of the challenges, as I mentioned, measuring the community and indirect emissions is the first challenge. Climate literacy is the second challenge, and the third is the internal capacity and corporate process integration. If you could move on to the next slide, Yuill. So I just wanted to show you a scale of what the current emissions in Edmonton look like on the pie chart on your right side, the the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we show you the proportion of community emissions to the corporate emission, which is almost 98% of the overall emissions for Edmonton, which makes it difficult for us to track the community side since unless the community starts reporting on the emissions on their own, or we figure out a mechanism for them to report, it would be difficult for us to monitor this on an annual basis. If you could move on to the next slide, Yuill. The second is the climate literacy, which is mostly to do with educating the community on the benefits of measuring their carbon footprint, as well as reporting on it, as well as internally the project managers need to be trained in terms of how to measure their project level carbon footprint. If you could move on to the next one, Yuill. The last is internal capacity and corporate process integration. As I mentioned, there are existing financial budget processes within the city. So one of the biggest obstacles or the challenges for us is to integrate that with the existing systems and frameworks that exist at the city of Edmonton. And then also, how do you build the internal capacity in terms of what kind of resources do you need? What kind of expertise do you need in-house to actually deliver on a carbon accounting framework is what this third challenge talks about. If you could move on to the next slide, Yuill. So the final slide is just an example of how we could possibly integrate this. This is a service package which is associated with the operating budget project at the city of Edmonton, where we may include in the future a section on climate change, which includes your project level carbon GHG impact of a particular project on your overall operating budget. So that's just an example for you guys to see. With this, we conclude our presentation and we would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Yuill and Abhishek. So I know we're running close to end of the session. So what I'll do is I'll take one or two questions, and then everybody, what I recommend doing, I see there's so many great questions coming through, please visit SSG's virtual booth. They'll have a lot of representatives there to be able to answer any of your questions that you have with regards to their presentation. So if I go back to, there was a question about the share calculated. So is the share calculated that you presented based on population, and how would one know what their municipality share is?
Right. So I can tackle that one. The shares, there was I think a follow-up response to it, which is that it was based on a methodology developed by C40, and that is the case for Edmonton. And there's kind of a fairly simple method that can be used that C40 has developed, or we've built on what the method that C40 used. And there's a couple other methods as well, which are a bit more complicated to get into detail. And we're actually working on a project called 1,000 Cities, which is a global project to identify the carbon budgets for 1,000 cities globally, of which a number of Canadian cities are included. And that's a more standard methodology. So I'd be happy to follow up with more details for anyone who wants to. If you want to just email me at this email address, I can share those approaches. And it's something that anyone can really calculate. It's not particularly complicated.
Thanks, Yuill. I did have another question here from Armando. Is embedded carbon accounted for within the carbon budget?
No, this is based on the basic plus methodology from the GPC protocol, which doesn't include embodied carbon.
All right, we had another question from Diane. Was there much pushback at council?
Abby.
So the carbon budgeting framework hasn't been presented to the council yet. So we'll be taking the suggested methodology to the council over the next couple of months. But the council is the one who asked us to come up with a carbon accounting framework. So we do have city council support to develop a reporting methodology.
Amazing. I see one more question here. a compliment. Actually, this is incredible and much needed. If other municipalities were to consider a similar type of project, what type of budget does one need, a ballpark?
In terms of coming up with the idea, I think it doesn't require a lot of funding, but then the implementation of resources is where the money would be needed in terms of, and especially where a lot of Canadian municipalities are suffering in terms of their bottom line because of COVID. Resources are coming at a premium. So that is where most of the investments would go into. I think you can implement a carbon accounting framework and Yuill can speak to it with a fairly simple methodology, like even an Excel spreadsheet can help you implement the initial carbon accounting framework. So there isn't a lot of investment in terms of technology that you need for implementing it.
Yeah.
Great, sorry about that. I was looking for my mute button. I think that's all I've got for questions. Anybody have one more last question to push through? We can squeeze one more in if anybody has one, or if I missed one, sorry, in the chat. I'll just wait 2 seconds to see if anything comes in. All right, so like I mentioned, that's it. Thank you so much, Yuill and Abhishek, for a great presentation. And like I mentioned before, they do have a booth in the virtual exhibit hall, so please go visit them. Follow with any questions that you may have with regard to their presentation, and you have their email addresses right there too. You can personally reach out to them. We thank you very much, Yuill and Abhishek, for a great presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us. We have our session starting at 1:30. You can join on there on the platform. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.